boots, honey. Glittery boots. I love them.
How are you this morning?
If you want to come, you're welcome to. Yes, ma'am. What? Yes, sir. You're going to go in that classroom. Yep. Miss Debbie, get in there.
I think
You want to turn that off? Y'all go on back there.
Yeah. It's time. Good morning, Lance.
Good morning.
How are you, honey? Good. How are you? I'm good, honey. I'm good.
Hi, darling. How are you, Mercedes? Hello. How are you, baby? Good. How are you? Uncle Wayne, can I go yet?
You betcha. How are you this morning? Good to see you.
Uncle Wayne.
He has been my Uncle Wayne for
Good to see you.
since I've been little. How are you, darling? Good. So
Who is a disciple? Is that our sermon? Our sermon? Who is a disciple?
Yeah.
Okay, and so where are we starting, honey?
I'm trying to figure that out right now. For,
I think it's 5, you finished 4.
yeah.
Yes.
We actually went through part of chapter 5, but I'm just kind of covering a couple of things there. Bless you.
Excuse me.
Just to kind of recap what we did there in chapter 5 in the 1 Corinthians, and you know, this chapter's always bothered me a lot, because I think you shouldn't be talking about this kind of stuff, you know, with the church, but they had to, and that's all there is to it. And so Paul, he writes to them, and he says, it's actually recorded that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. Now, to start with, you know, you can read that, and you can come up with any conclusion that you want to. If we didn't have any more information than that, we'd probably say, well, it was his mother, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think it probably was his stepmother. But whatever the case was, it was horrible. And Paul said, this is kind of, you know, sometimes when I read these things, I kind of chuckle, because he said, this isn't even named among the Gentiles. They had such a low opinion of the Gentiles, and probably rightfully so. But, you know, Paul, he had to deal with a lot of things. And in a lot of ways, I think it's like if you went to another country. I know that Ruel has to deal with a lot of things in his country that, because of the fact that those people aren't Christians, or the majority of them aren't. They're in when Lance and I went to Paraguay, they had to deal with a lot of these things there in that country, because most of those people were, most of them were Catholics to start with. And they just had a totally different viewpoint than what we would have on things. But anyway, Paul, when he talks to him about this, he says, and you're puffed up. And, you know, it's kind of like when you go to a different part of the United States, they have different phrases and different words. When you go up north, people up there don't really understand Texan very well. But, you know, Paul said, I think what he was saying was that you are arrogant. You think that, you know, that this is something that is beyond, you know, your dignity. I don't know what all he had in mind. But he said, rather, you should have mourned. I feel like when I read this, I feel like that what was going on, and this is, again, this is just the way I read it. It doesn't mean that it's right. And sometimes you'll see someone that they'll, well, I'll give you a good example. I'll give you a good example. I told Sherry about this before, but when my wife and I had first met, she lived in Oklahoma, and I got her parents' permission to bring her down to Fort Worth, where my parents lived. My grandmother had to come as an escort, but that was okay, you know. But anyway, we went to Farmer's Daughter to eat. This is a restaurant in Fort Worth. I don't think it's there anymore. It was quite nice. And so anyway, we sat down. They've got stuff on the walls. It was really a fancy place, a lot fancier than what I needed to be in. But anyway, and Gatha ordered ribs. I had never eaten a rib in my life. Didn't know what they were. We just didn't eat those, you know, probably because we couldn't afford to. Well, anyway, they brought the ribs, and so she picked up the rib to eat it. And I thought, what have I got myself into? I thought, you don't pick up your food to eat it. And I said something to her about it. She said, that's how you eat ribs. And so, you know, I was puffed up. I was looking down at her. And I think that, and it's kind of in the opposite way, I think that these people were looking down on Paul. Thought, well, this is nothing bad. After all, we've got these temples, these 12 temples, and they were dedicated to various gods and goddesses, and they had, I think I mentioned there last week that they had in one of those temples they had 1,000 prostitutes. I don't know what size this place must have been, but it was horrible. It must have been horrible. And so they probably thought, well, this is no big deal. We've seen a whole lot worse than this, but it was wrong, and Paul needed to straighten them out real quick like. He said that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. And so when you read that, you know, there's a lot of things that went through my mind, but you got to back up a little bit too, and you got to look at Corinth, because there in Corinth they had these gods or goddesses, Aphrodite, Apollo, Poseidon, and so it was a wealthy city, had all these temples, and Aphrodite was the Greek goddess of love. And so this is what these people grew up with there in that church, in that area. And so, you know, Paul, he needed to take care of this, but he needed to handle it in the right way. And when he said that this person should be taken away from among you, what he was talking about was really just church discipline. That's all there is to it. And you know, when I think about that, I'm no expert on that by any means. I've told you before, but one time when I was at one church that I was, well, actually there's more than once, but I remember the first time. It was a situation where it was a bad thing that was going on. A member of the church, and she was doing some things that were not, you know, nice. She had a business, and back then you go into these stores, and they would have these magazine racks. All these stores had them, and they on her magazine rack inside of the office of the hotel that she owned, there were a lot of bad magazines there and so forth. And so the word got back to the elders about that, and about the fact that she was doing something else she shouldn't have done. And so the first thing that the elders did was come to tell me I need to take care of it. I was talking to Troy yesterday about something, and he told me, he said, Dad, I'm just overwhelmed right now with all that I have to do. And I said, you know, the problem that a lot of times, a lot of churches have is they hire a preacher, and they think he's supposed to do everything. He's supposed to visit the sick. He's supposed to go try to bring new members in, and so on and so forth. And I said, Troy, what I would do is because this is a fairly large congregation, and he's got some good elders. I said I would sit down with him and say, look, guys, I'm overwhelmed. I can't do all this. I'm gonna have to have some help. And is there something you can do to take some of this off my back? Because the preacher's job is to preach, and that's what he's hired for. That's why he's supported. And so, you know, in this case here, with that woman, you know, doing what she did, I went to her, and I sat down and talked with her, and this woman's wealthy. And so the thing was resolved by her saying, "Oh, never said, no, that's not how it's resolved." I told her, I said, "This is what they've said, and they have said that they're going to withdraw fellowship from you." Well, we had told the congregation what the elder said. The next Sunday, whenever she came through the door, the very first thing all the women did was go back and grab a hold of her and hug her. The discipline didn't work. It'd be just like a child. You spank a child, one parent spanks the child, the other parent's grabbing hold of, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry." It doesn't work. Well, in this case here, I don't know how that they would have done church discipline back then, have no way of knowing that, except for what the Bible says. But I think what they should have done with this individual, and I think they did it, they went and told him, you know, that we can't have this kind of behavior. But we'll read about that a little bit more a little later on. But anyway, when you read this, the church members would have been instructed if they were following the teachings that the Bible gives. And of course, Paul was an apostle and inspired, so he would know what to do. They should have gone to the man and said, "Look, we can't have this kind of behavior, so therefore we're going to withdraw fellowship from you." Now, we've talked about this before in various places, and I don't know if I have here or not. But what does it mean to withdraw fellowship? Does it mean that you could stand at the door and you say you can't come in here? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that what they should have done in this case was they should have just, the elders or leaders of the church, and elders would have been the case, they should have told them, "Look, you know, what you're doing is wrong. We're not going to fellowship with you anymore." What does the word fellowship mean? It means joint participation. So we're not going to eat with you. We're not going to meet you in your home. We're not going to greet you. We're going to treat you as though that you're not here. And we talked about that before. Here, what you do is if someone comes that's engaged in some kind of behavior that we don't think that they should be, can you bar them from coming through the door? And we talked about that. And I don't think that that's the right approach, but the leaders have to make those decisions. But when I read about this, the church members there, where this incident took place where I was, they should have gone to the ladies, and they should have said, "Ladies, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this woman change her behavior, and so we need your help." I think that's what they should have done. And as I look back at it, I should have advised them that way and said, "Would you please do this for me? Would you go and tell her, you know, what's going on? And would you tell the church members what's going on?" But anyway, in this case, it worked out good. We'll read about that just a little bit. You know, one of the things that most people that have been in the religious world at all, they've heard of the excommunication. And I read about that in some different books. Some of the stories that I read about excommunication. Well, we can't tell someone that they can't take the Lord's Supper. That's the way I feel about it. And that might be someone, you might feel differently, but that's the way I feel about it. But in the Catholic Church and some of the other denominational churches, they do that. They say, "You can't take the Lord." Of course, when I was in the Episcopal Church, the way we took communion was, and I don't know how in the world we got out of church before supper time back then, but everybody would have to parade up to the front, and the priest would be standing up there. Now, all you got was the cracker, the little piece of bread, whatever you want to call it. And so you'd come up there, and he would give you that piece of bread. He'd say these little sayings he would say, and put it on your tongue. And then when you got through, the wine was up there, and they used wine, and he was the one drinking. And so the whole thing was wrong. But we don't have anything in the Bible that talks about excommunication. I read when I was doing some study on this, and this one man, and this is a member of the church, and he said that the man should have been excluded from membership in the Church of Christ. I don't know how you do that, because I didn't put him in the Church of Christ. You didn't put him in the Church of Christ. How can you exclude him? That's God's job. And so I think what they should have done is and I don't know where this man got this information from, but I think that they should have made it publicly known, talking back to the congregation, what the sin was and what the discipline was. But, there's so many things that you could go through with this. I think in all likelihood, if this is like we see it on, just on the paper here, I'm wondering why that they didn't go talk to the man's father. I mean, that's where I would have started. Said, what in the world are you thinking? And I would have talked to the woman. What are you thinking? But we don't know all that, so it's hard to. There's too many moving pieces in it. In verse 4, he kind of gives the way that you do this action. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you're gathered together along with my spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Well, we don't have any spiritual power in the sense of doing something mystical like that. But if you, with that woman I was talking about, if the elders had said to her, you're not, you can attend here, we can't keep you from coming through the door, but we're not going to be in fellowship with you. We're not going to go out and eat with you. We're not going to greet you with open arms until you repent. And I wish that they would have done that, but they didn't. But then Paul says in verse 6, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And this is the whole purpose of I think, of church leadership, of church discipline. We don't have elders, and so it's more difficult for us to do something like that. But I think the main thing is just that you can't, if you have something going on with someone or someone's, if you don't take care of it, then it involves the whole group. The whole group can be drawn into the same thing. And I've seen this. I mean, I've heard of places where, and I'm not talking about sinful things. I'm just talking about things, wrong attitudes about them. It's the same thing to me. The sin of this man was certainly not the only sin in that congregation, because we all sin. And one sin's not worse than the other. And so when I thought about this a lot this past week, and have you ever heard someone say this? If I'd been there, I would have. You weren't there, you didn't, and that's the way it is. I don't know what I would have done if I were Paul. But Paul was guided by God. We're guided by the Word. And so we know that the main purpose is, there's two main purposes, was to protect the congregation from the influence of sin. And the second thing was to lead that guy back to the Lord. That was the second thing. And so, rather than just to say, okay, we're going to take your key away from you, when we go to worship next Sunday, we'll lock the door. If you come knocking on the door, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. But I think that there's ways to take care of it that would convince the person to change his lifestyle. And it worked. And we'll read about that in just a little bit. The Jews, and I don't know why God picked it. I think I do, but I'm not God, so I can't say for certain. Why he used yeast to represent sin, but we kind of understand that. I don't have a lot of experience with yeast, but I know years ago there was a lady in one of the congregations that I went to, and her and her daughter were marvelous cooks. And I would go to, this wasn't where I was preaching, it was in another town, but I always looked forward to going, and I was hoping that they asked me to go home with them, because they made yeast rolls that were just out of this world. And they told me about you have to have a starter and all. I'm not a cook, so I don't understand all that stuff, but I know it worked. Well, the Jews were taught that yeast represents sin, because sin can grow. And so they were told, okay, you can't have any yeast before the Passover. You've got to get rid of it. And they took it to such extremes that they would clean their houses thoroughly, even get candles and make sure that there wasn't, and I don't understand why that the yeast would be in the corners of the house, but that's what I read, you know. But in other words, symbolically, do everything you can to get rid of all the yeast or all the leaven that's in your house. Well, that was symbolically what God was saying then. Get rid of that in your life. Get into the corners of your heart and get rid of the sin. Get rid of those things that are contrary to God's will. But when Paul is talking to these people here, he's trying to connect it with those types of things that they were understanding. Do you not know that little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And so when you read that, you think, well, how does that fit together? I'm going to look at a scripture real quick and see if this gives any light to it. John 19, I believe it's verse 14. Yeah, 19, 14. See what it says. Now it was preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, he said to the Jews, behold your king. So it was just tying in with the same idea, getting prepared, and then the crucifixion. But Paul wanted them to realize that the yeast in the Passover, when he says Christ is our Passover, that, of course, Lance talked about that with the lamb and so forth, and so Jesus was our Passover lamb, the sacrifice. He said, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So there he ties it all together. So he's not talking about the physical yeast, but he's talking about, again, about the sin. You get rid of the sin, malice, wickedness. I was doing some studying about this sort of thing just recently. And, you know, when a child, you start raising a child, and I was watching Olivia there at her party the other day. I don't know what age they start learning, but it's a lot sooner than what we think. And they'll learn things, because when I got there, Lance was there and Debbie was there, and Brittany had Olivia, and I went over to hold my, she doesn't know me. She doesn't know who I am. I haven't been around her enough. When Lance comes in, boy, her face lights up and she's ready, you know. And so, you know, they start learning at such a young age. And so when Paul talks about malice and wickedness, he's talking about some sins that we're familiar with. We know what he's talking about. But there's so many things that a sin starts with a seed. And when we do something that we know is wrong, unless we stop right then and say, okay, I've got to change. And we say, well, I'm going to ask God to forgive me. Well, that's fine. But it goes farther than that. You've got to change your behavior. You've got to change your way of thinking. And so that's what Paul is talking about. And that's so important for us to do that. So then he goes on in verse 9. He says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Now, I think that there probably was another place that another letter that Paul wrote, but perhaps not. We'll look in 2 Corinthians just a second. But something else that I wanted to point out was that when Paul wrote what he did in verse 9, he evidently had written another letter to them, one that we don't have a copy of. Otherwise, that sentence wouldn't have made any sense. When he says, don't keep company with immoral people. Now then, if Lance or James or Neil or me, we said, don't keep company with immoral people. what would come to your mind? I'm gonna have to stay home, because I don't know who's immoral or not, who's not. I mean, some people, it's obvious. I don't think that that's what Paul was saying. I think what he was telling them, don't keep company with people that you realize will cause you to go down the wrong path. I think that's what he's saying. If I had a friend that, every other word that came out of his mouth was a profane word, then I would probably not be around that person, nor would be around him. If you turn on your television and you see programs on there where there's all sorts of behavior that we don't agree with, I'm going to change channels. And so I think that's what Paul is saying. It's just, look at who you're with, because whoever you're with is going to influence you to some degree. And so it's important that we consider that. And so when he says not keep company with sexually immoral people, that goes certainly farther than some other things that all sins are the same. And I think we just have to realize that. And so Paul says in verse 10, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous or extortioners or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. So he's talking about everybody. And in this case here, he's talking about this man that the whole conversation initiated from. In a little bit, we're going to look at something else that Paul says in chapter 6. But, when Paul is talking about these things, and when he says talked about the not eating with people, this is something that I think is been so misconstrued. There are some people who are Christians that I don't know when it occurred, but some years ago they developed this idea that you can't eat in the church building. And so I have some friends that were in that group. I haven't seen it for years, so I don't know if they still are or not. But the idea that they had was that we couldn't, if we had a fellowship hall attached to our building. Okay. Up in Oklahoma, we had one like that. They built this building over here separate from the church, and that's fine. But the whole idea that they had was that it was a sin if you had a meal, basically, it seems to me like on church property, more or less. That means I couldn't eat in my house. It's foolish. I mean, you have to think of what God is talking about. And I think if you go back and you study these things, you kind of understand, because another place when Paul talked about these types of things, from what I read from the scholars, the commentaries, it was like if we had dinner over here in this building, which we're going to do today, and you brought a meal and I brought a meal, and somebody else shows up and they didn't have one, they didn't bring any food, we'd say, you'll have to sit over there, we'll give you a cracker. Paul was talking about all these things. He's talking about the heart, our attitudes. And so when people came to this point of saying, you can't eat inside the church building, and I had a guy that I knew quite well that this was his position, and sometimes I do things that I regret later on, but I'd actually bought a business from this guy. And so I knew him and his wife very well. Lance went to school with one of his granddaughters. So they were out eating one day in a restaurant. And I went over to him and I said, how you doing? And I said, you enjoying your meal? Yeah, it's great. And I said, says you've got houses to eat and drink in. That's what you've been telling me. So that means you can't go to a restaurant. And I was trying to make the point with him. When Paul said you have house to eat and drink in, they were going together from house to house, having worship and then having meals in their houses. And so that wasn't what Paul was talking about. Paul was talking about you can't, if you have someone else there and you're ignoring them and you're not letting them eat, then you've got the wrong spirit. And the same thing over here. If people came to church on Sunday morning and their minds were not on worshiping God, but on what we're going to have for lunch, that would be wrong. You'd have the wrong spirit, the wrong attitude. And that's what Paul dealt with so many times. And sometimes people will take these scriptures like that and make laws where God didn't intend for them to be, I think. So anyway, that's enough of that, I guess. There was one other thing that he said. Oh yeah, in verse 10, he said that I didn't mean with sexual immoral people in this world, because if that was the case, he said you'd have to go out in the world. So what Paul was trying to make them understand is that we're not judging those outside of the church. That's not our job. We see things that people do outside of the church who aren't Christians, and I think that we can look at it, we can say, well, their behavior is not correct. It's not pleasing to God, but I think that that's probably as far as we need to go. It's not my job to decide whether or not they're going to go to heaven or go to hell. And so then let's get over to chapter 6. When I read things like I do here in chapter 6, again, I have to really stop and think, because you kind of have to wonder what Paul was dealing with, because to start off, he said, dare, any of you. And that word dare, it's kind of a different type of word for us. What Paul was saying was, you haven't so much nerve that you're going to ignore God's word. That's really what he was saying. Dare you to do this. He said, daring you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints. Well, I admire Paul, and I feel sorry for Paul at the same time, because he had to deal with all of these things. But that was his job. That was his calling. I don't know exactly what happened, what caused Paul to have to write about this in the first place. But it seems to me like that some matters had risen in the church, because he wouldn't have been talking about something outside of the church. And he says that you got these problems, and you have chosen to go to court to settle them. Now, I've heard people in the church before say, well, you can't go to court for anything, basically. Well, that wasn't what Paul was saying. I think what he's talking about are differences that occurred between brethren, between church members. And so Paul was kind of upset. Why in the world did you do that? Why would you do that with a brother or sister? And they were neglecting the authority of God, and we're going to show you why in just a minute. God has a will, and he expressed that will in this book. He said, this is how I want you to handle things, this is how I want you to live, this is how I want you to think, and how I want you to dress. It's all in the book. And so these people had decided that they weren't going to follow God's will or God's desires. They were going to do it their way. And we don't know what happened. It might have been that one brother bought a piece of property from another brother and didn't pay the obligation. We don't know what it was. But back in Matthew chapter 18, God had told them how you're supposed to handle these things. And so their problem was they didn't consult the proper authority. Matthew 18:15. Moreover, if your brother sins against you. Well, when you read that, probably, if you're like most people, you think of some kind of a sin, like I don't know, stealing your property or, whatever. It doesn't matter. So I just throw that word sin out of my mind when I read this to try to get to the point. If your brother does something that you feel like is displeasing to God, I'll just put it that way. Paul says this is how you handle it. You go talk to him. So when I studied this and thought about it, I thought, this really is, and Lance talked about this not too terribly long ago. If you have a matter like that, Paul says the way you do it is just like this here in Matthew chapter 18. Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, over the years, I've been so blessed because I work with good people, and I haven't had these situations occur very much. But the way the world handles this, you have someone do something to you, you take your phone out, you go to Facebook, and you post it to the world. They didn't have Facebook back then, so they just went to their neighbors. And I'm not going to use the tell a woman joke. I'm not going to use that one. You tell somebody. Well, the first thing you know, everybody knows it. And what's your purpose? You want everybody to jump on that person. It's not to try to solve the problems because you want them to beat them up. And so Paul says that's not how you do it. You go tell him or her alone. And then Paul says, or Jesus says in Matthew 18, if he hears you, you've gained your brother. That's such a peaceful way to handle things. We're going to have problems. We're going to have differences of opinion. Somebody's going to get rubbed the wrong way, and I know that. That's what I told Shirley this morning. I've got scar tissue on my tongue where I've had to bite it so many times, So Paul says, because this is the first thing that some little thing. They won't listen to me. God's already taken care of this. Jesus already taken care of it. He said, but if he will not hear, take with you one or two more. Well, if you go to somebody and you've had a problem with them and you want to talk to them about it and they just shun you, just turn their back on you, if you come back a little later on, you've got one or two more of your brothers, their brothers, with you. In all likelihood, they're going to kind of change their disposition a little bit. They realize this is serious. And he says, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. And this is always such a problem with people. And our memories are selective. We want to remember, we remember what we want to remember. So you have a disagreement with somebody. Husbands and wives do this. I've got a lot of experience on bad experiences with husbands and wives trying to counsel. You take someone with you, 2 or 3 witnesses with you, and so that way, maybe the actual words or things that were done can be accurate. I might misremember. But if I have 2 or 3 with me, then they'll help me remember. And he says, and these are all Christians. These are all Christians that Jesus is talking about. And so it would be the same thing with Paul there in 1 Corinthians. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. We're going to have to hurry. But if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. So that's where you go with it. That's how you do it. And I'm gonna stop there because I'd like to spend a little more time on that one. We'll stop on verse 17. God's way of doing things is always gonna be the best, and we just need to remember that.